Hey everyone, Eben here. So today I'm going to be walking you through a 30-minute speed painting process of the landscape I created earlier this week. And I got a lot of requests on Instagram and Facebook for a walkthrough of this video, so I appreciate those of you who gave some feedback and input there. This one's for you. And if you like the video today, please go ahead and subscribe below, hit that like button, leave a comment, and let me know if you would like to see similar content in the future or if you have any requests for content on this channel. I do new videos every Wednesday of the week, and I do live streams every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can also find the link to the brush pack I use in this video in the description below. Alright, enjoy the video. Alright, so let's just dive right in here and start the countdown. So, the first thing that I usually do for a speed painting is I just want to kind of fill up the canvas with a lot of loose texture and color variety. I just picked a random color here from the hue slider over there, and I'm also, as I put it down, I'm making slight variations to that slider. Changing saturation, changing hue levels, changing value a little bit, and I've just gone ahead and filled in the background with some blue just to get rid of that white space, because ultimately I very rarely will want to have pure white in a painting, but if I do, it will be relegated to a very specific area, so I just want to get rid of that right off the bat. And then the next thing I'm doing here is I'm just continuing to lay down this texture. I have no idea what I'm going to create at this point, and I'm just using this large textured brush to put down some nice crisp texture everywhere, and I'm just trying out some different hues and sort of seeing what comes out. And I think what I'm noticing at this point is there's a pretty limited value range, so I'm starting to push my values a little bit, include some more upper mid highlights there in the top, and then I'm starting to push some darker values in my foreground as well. And so these are just things that are sort of the first steps in forming this as a landscape, or at least as a three-dimensional piece, because generally the sky is going to be brighter. It's going to settle on the top half of the canvas, or top third or 2/3, however you want to do it. And then in the foreground, you're going to see a lot of darker values that you don't see anywhere else in the piece. And you'll notice here I've also zoomed out at this point, and there's really no need for me to be zoomed in any further than this at the start of the piece. This is helping me to gain some perspective on the whole composition and how it's all working together. And so it's useful to maintain this distance arguably throughout the whole process, but at least until you have a good idea of what it is you're putting together, and you have a solid sense of the composition that you're assembling here. So the next thing I'm doing is I'm going in with my mixer brush, and I'm just sort of smoothing out different areas and creating some contrast between those sort of jagged textured areas that I laid down earlier and the more smoothed out sort of atmospheric areas that I'm putting down now. And this is something you'll see me do throughout my process to the very end, really, is deliberately forming and losing edges as I work. And it's super useful in any painting, but especially in a landscape where there's the potential for atmospheric variations and cloud formations, and especially when you get into distant objects, you will see often this kind of contrast between the fading atmospheric effects and the hard edges of, for example, a mountain ridge as it sort of breaches the horizon there. And then the next thing I'm doing is I'm starting to develop my perspective a little bit. I kind of, at this point, wanted to give the impression that we were looking up from below, so I'm using a lot of concave or convex arcs from the bottom up to sort of create the impression that these various layers of the landscape are being seen from below. Although I do end up sort of reversing that decision a little bit later and going with a more straightforward, straight-on perspective and sort of increasing the distance. At this point, I was kind of envisioning sort of looking up at some kind of dark castle or something, but I think the whole feeling of the piece at this point was very moody and muted, and it's you know, I could have run with that, but for me, I just love playing with light, playing with contrast, and using bounce light and all this stuff, and I just wasn't able to really do that with that setup. So you can see here I did end up brightening the sky a little bit, and that served two purposes, is just to inject a little bit more color around the focal point and also to create more contrast around that focal point. And you'll notice I only brightened it up around that area, and that's just a design choice I made that's not necessarily realistic, but it is going to work well for us with this painting. And so I'm just sort of tapping in some different foliage areas. I'm still, throughout this whole process, I'm just working on one layer. And so even with the sky that's sort of supposed to be smooth, I'm still, to sort of create spaces between that foliage, I'm still just tapping in sky color with that dry brush, and it's not necessarily the right texture for a sky, but I'm not really concerned with that at this point. I'm really just trying to get the shapes and the colors down really quickly. I'm not getting lost in any of these details. I'm just moving around, filling up and developing any space that I see that needs developing here. So from this sort of general mid-tone layer I have here, I'm starting to dial up some areas where light might be hitting, and I'm starting to see that I have something of a top right light source at this point. And so I'm just starting to accent some of these hills with this awesome rough comb brush here, which is just so useful for creating these kind of transitions in a landscape. And so I'm starting to selectively develop lighting in areas where it might be hitting, but I'm also bearing in mind that I don't want to have those areas really close to the edge of the canvas, so I've only developed them around the focal point or around the pathway that will ultimately be leading to that focal point. And I want to keep everything else pretty low contrast, pretty vague, and I'm not going to be sort of dialing in much sunlight in those areas. So I'm continuing to push those highlights, and I'm starting to see that maybe I want to have some dappled sunlight in this scene. And that's creating an interesting effect already, because it's almost as if there are clouds obscuring certain sections of the painting. And by starting out with all these cool, dull colors as a base on the canvas, I've actually sort of implicitly created shadow areas across this landscape. And from there, I can sort of play that up by adding highlight areas where the sun is hitting. And that creates this really interesting effect that squares well with the cloudy pattern that we're building in the sky. And so moving on to the clouds here, I've had a couple questions about my cloud process, and I actually might be creating a short tutorial on that soon, but as it applies to this specific piece, one thing I'm doing right off the bat is I'm establishing perspective in the clouds. And this is something I feel like I missed for a long time, and that I see a lot of other people missing, is that the clouds aren't just sitting on this flat wall that is the skyline. You know, it's not just this canvas board in the back of a theater set. They occupy a three-dimensional space just like the landscape itself. So you want to keep that in mind when you're plotting out their shapes. And one way I really sort of reinforce that is by having the clouds expand towards the top of the canvas and sort of follow this curve and sort of blooming out towards the top. And then towards the top, you're also going to see more of the bottom of the clouds, where I'm painting in this gray shadow side of the cloud. And then just a very slight highlight on the right side of the cloud where the light is hitting it. But then also towards the horizon, those clouds are going to flatten out. They're going to flatten, and you're going to see more of that three-dimensional sort of fluffy half-lit cloud pattern, because the sun is hitting them from a different angle. You're seeing them from far away. So you're not going to see so much of their underside as you are their sort of front side there. So that's something I just quickly painted in there. I made kind of a circular motion to it, which is a nice effect you can use to sort of create the impression of a wider lens, or greater, what's the term? Greater field of view. And so instead of just having them flat across the horizon, you can have them curve around like that, so it's almost like you're looking up at the bottom of a dome. And of course I sort of ran out of space at the top there, but I've included enough to just sort of really hint at that. And then the next thing I'm doing here is developing this focal point further, and I really don't know what it is. I think it's, at this point, I'm just sort of experimenting with light hitting that area. I sort of thought about maybe turning it into some kind of statue, but at the end of the day, it just became an interesting rock, and ultimately you don't need much more than that for a focal point. It all depends upon how you set it up. So it doesn't even, in this case, this isn't a castle or a statue or a heroic figure or anything. This is just the landscape speaking for itself, and you can make it more interesting by using certain design elements to convince the viewer that it is interesting, by playing up contrast around there, by playing up saturation, by positioning it at a certain point in the canvas, which you'll see in a moment. I actually shift it over so it's not quite right there in the center, and that actually gives it a bit more interest and a bit more effect as the focal point. So what I just did there, as well as I used the wand tool to select all of the shadows, and I went over them with a mid-range sort of dull blue, and lightened up the value and injected more of that blue, which really pushes it further into the distance. The way the shadow was set up there, it looked like it was a lot closer, and now you can see it looks a lot further away now that that value range has been reduced. And so this is where the painting starts to take a turn from, us looking up at sort of a close rocky structure, to us sort of viewing from a distance this larger, more distant mountain object here. And then the next thing I'm doing is I'm just trying to create some sharpness around that area as well. And I do this with the lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool, which for me is often a lot more simple and effective than trying to draw every curve with the normal lasso tool. So I'm making selections, and then I'm just going over there with that rough comb brush and creating some sort of sparing texture. that roughly follows the direction of the light. And then I'm doing the same thing to develop the landscape in front of it, but I'm using a much lower value, much less contrast. I've moved the green over into a cool area to sort of imply that section of the mountain is sort of cast in shadow from a cloud somewhere. So it's still receiving light from the same direction, because even when the sun is blocked by a cloud, there's a lot of ambient skylight and sunlight hitting that area, but it will also be picking up more light from the sky above than it is from the sun itself. So that will push the green more towards a blue-green, and it will dull it down a little bit. So, you'll notice as I go through this, I'm very carefully selecting areas that I want to develop and that I want to create contrast, and they all sort of follow this plot line from the bottom left of the canvas all the way to this mountain object here. So the next thing I'm doing here, as you can see, is I'm using the warp tool on the entire canvas, which is something I probably wouldn't do if this wasn't a speed painting, because it can sort of stretch things out and make them wonky. But it's pretty simple. It's pretty quick to do something like this, and I think it makes a huge difference. I shifted that mountain over to the sort of 2/3 mark on the canvas, and it just looks quite a bit more interesting over there than it does right in the center. And it gives the viewer an opportunity to sort of cross the whole breadth of the canvas from the beginning of the road on the left all the way over to this focal point towards the right. So they make this diagonal transition, which means they're covering more of the canvas. There's more space for them to observe here. And so I'm playing up some of that reflected blue from the sky and the shadows there, and I think I saw in doing that maybe this sort of secondary hill was sort of interrupting the flow of things a little bit, so I tried to work through it a little bit, but then I ended up just painting over it with that shadow cloud color, and that's just helping to introduce or helping to increase the flow and aid the viewer in getting to that mountain uninterrupted. By the way, you can check out a video I just released on flow in your paintings, which is definitely something I'm playing off of here. You can check out that video on my channel as well, and I walk through how you can incorporate flow into your work and sort of draw the viewer's eye in and keep it within the piece. So I'm just sort of playing around with the details of this focal area here. I probably didn't need to. I'd say if there was anything in this piece that I sort of could have done more efficiently, it was developing this area. It was probably fine as it was, but I sort of wanted to see if I could, make it more of a readable object rather than just a sort of rocky spire. But ultimately, I just sort of ended up going back on a lot of those decisions, and I recognized that I was experimenting for too long, so I just sort of erased that and moved on. And of this whole process, you'll notice I've spent, the largest percentage of time working on everything around that focal area. And in creating a speed painting like this, that's in creating any painting really, but especially when you're working with a timer like this, paying attention to how you distribute your efforts and how you distribute your time spent in different areas is very important. For example, I've been spending all this time working on this focal area, but you'll notice these areas around the edge of the canvas, there's still that big patch of blue that doesn't really belong over there on the side, and there's all that rough texture that I haven't even touched since the very beginning. And that's because I recognize that it's not nearly as important, and it's not important because I'm making it unimportant. I'm choosing to develop one specific area to a really high degree, and when I do that, I draw the eye away from those other points. So if someone looks at this, they're not gonna go straight to all those jagged, undeveloped edges. They're gonna go right to this big rock spire in the middle, and all these fun flowy clouds and contrast around it. You'd be pretty surprised at what people will miss when you decide for them what they're going to see. So this is important for a number of reasons. A, it's going to help your painting look better overall, because you're going to have areas of focus and areas of non-focus, and that's just more aesthetically pleasing. That's just sort of how the human eye works. We don't see everything at once. We see specific things that we're looking at, and everything else is sort of out of focus. So right off the bat, creating areas of focus and non-focus is going to be more appealing for the eye. But B, it saves you time, because I didn't have to spend a lot of time working on all these peripheral elements, all of these sort of hills, and what really accounts for almost 50% of this space. I probably spent 2 or 3 minutes tops developing. So and I ended up with a product in 30 minutes that looked good overall, even though I didn't really put much time into half of the canvas. So I'd say if there's anything to take away from this, being able to distribute your time and your the work you put into your canvas according to the importance of those areas in your composition is really going to be one of the most important things you do in creating a speed painting, and also just in working more efficiently and effectively with any painting project. So I'm going back in with this mixer brush again, and I just noticed there was a lot of jagged texture everywhere, and the landscape wasn't very well formed. So I'm just going in and I'm smoothing out key areas to help sort of shape the landscape a bit. Notice I'm not smoothing out everything, and I'm leaving a lot of that texture in there, and that's just because when the eye perceives an area like that, a combination of large smooth shapes and small textured shapes is always going to look more realistic than one or the other. So that's kind of why I start out with a lot of this rough texture, is because for me, it's easier to put in a lot of gritty texture and smooth it out later than it is to create a really smooth painting and then try to sort of inject texture in there. For me, it just doesn't really work well as far as workflow goes. And what I'm doing here, I actually had a couple people asking about, they were talking about the sort of flowy, swirly, fantastical quality of these clouds. And I'm actually using the Smudge Tool, which I have hotkeyed to S. I have my brush hotkeyed to B, I have my mixer brush hotkeyed to A, and I have my Smudge Tool hotkeyed to S. And I'm always sort of switching between them because they all serve their own very specific purpose. The Smudge Tool in Photoshop, unlike in Procreate, actually, I'm sure there are different ways you can play with the settings, but for the most part, it pushes the paint a lot more aggressively. So you can use it to sort of pull out different areas and create all those little sort of swirly spots and actually change the shape of something without blurring it, and sort of accentuate the existing variations and curves and everything. Unlike the mixer brush, which will generally actually just sort of blur things out a little bit, and you can't be quite as forceful with pushing around the pixels. It just tend to blend them a bit more, of course depending upon your settings, but that's how I've set up the mixer brushes that I've included with this pack. And so I think I checked the clock at this point and I noticed I was sort of running out of time here, so I thought I should probably at least give these other areas a little bit of attention because they're starting to look pretty rough in comparison to what I've developed in the center there. So I'm just using this rough comb brush again to create some really large, loose indications of form in the landscape. I'm also, notice I'm not just using straight green for the foliage and the grass along the hillside here. I'm switching, I'm creating color variety. I'm shifting from red to yellow to green and everything in between, and different levels of value and intensity of the color. And that's just going to help to make your piece much more realistic, because everything in the natural world has some color variation in it, because things are growing and decaying at different rates, and things are in different levels of sunlight or exposed to different shadows. So there's always going to be color variation, and it's really great to get into the habit of every few strokes just moving that color slider a little bit, either shifting the hue or just moving it to a different place in your color palette there just by a little bit. And that's gonna, you can even, what I do on Procreate sometimes is I just move the color palette really close to my canvas so I can just keep dabbing back and forth, keep making small adjustments, putting down a couple strokes. It's actually something I picked up from Marco Bucci. He's really big into that, and he has a great lesson on color harmony, which talks a lot about that. So you should check that out as well. But yeah, anyway, some of the last things I'm doing here are actually some of the bolder strokes in the painting and take up the most space. I'm just kind of trying to convert these peripheral areas into something that coherently expresses a three-dimensional space rather than just sort of, random marks. And then I kind of got this idea of putting a little river in across the path there, just because, I don't know, it was nice. I think I saw that blue color there and I just thought I'd run with it. So yeah, I'm playing up the highlights around that area. It's a nice transition point between our foreground and our distant mountain there. And so I think at this point I wouldn't say I was panicking, but I was sort of skeptical about being able to wrap this up in the next 2.5 minutes, because it was just sort of a big mess in the corner, and I didn't really know how to resolve it. And so what I ended up doing was just sort of painting some of it away, giving more creating more sky, which I think helped to open up the piece quite a bit more, lowering down the contrast there, smoothing it out. I'm not creating any more texture. I'm just creating a lot of vagueness and sort of out of focus landscape elements over there. And then I kind of had this idea of showing a little bit more of that river, because this shape, this big kind of muddy green shape at the bottom was taking up quite a bit of the canvas, and I didn't really like how that was working out. So I just pushed it down a little bit. I thought I'd try to develop a little river in the corner here, and nothing too bright or high contrast, but just enough to sort of show where that river is headed, and where it's coming from, so forth. And I'm sort of thinking about the color of the sky as well. That's going to be playing into the reflections on the river. as well as, you know, when it becomes more foamy, it does turn into more of a light blue, a light sort of saturated white blue while it's in the shadows. And then one of the last things I'm doing here is just taking this big blob and just sort of really quickly and desperately trying to turn it into sort of something that has a bit more perspective and a bit more shape. So I'm using these sort of sweeping curves to show that it's tapering a bit towards the distance and that it's expanding in towards the viewer. And I'd say if I were to go back and do this again, I would probably have plotted that area out a little bit more deliberately sooner in the process. But as you can see, with just a few seconds to spare here, I was sort of just frantically trying to make some sense out of it. So and of course I couldn't resist spending another few seconds just getting in some last key elements. And I think what ended up sort of selling this area ultimately was having some nice bright saturated green that sort of shows that it was closer and that it was catching some of that sunlight. So with that done, I think the last thing I needed to do here was just adjust the levels. I wanted to make sure I was utilizing the full range of values available to me, so I just pushed those shadows up and or down into a deeper value, and I pushed my highlights up with the levels tool there. And that's it. That's really all there is to it. So thanks for joining me on this really fun speed painting adventure here. So once again, if you like this video and you want to see more stuff like this, please subscribe to the channel, hit that bell so you know when I'm creating new videos. I come out with a new video at least once a week, although this week it's been 3, but you can definitely guarantee that I'll be putting one out on Wednesdays, and of course I do my live streams on Sunday at 12 p.m. EST, so please join me for that. It's a great opportunity to have a conversation about this kind of stuff and ask questions and be part of the process. I have the people that join me have a lot of input on what's being created, so that's always a lot of fun. And once again, you can find the link to the brush pack I've used in this video in the description below. Alright, thanks again for joining me, and take care.